Good morning.
Morning.
Hello, Jason. Is that you? There you are. What's up?
Hey, hey, hey.
It's the Tuesday crew.
Got a haircut.
All right.
You get a haircut?
Hey, yeah. Yeah, finally.
I do hair and nails. I went to cosmetology school a couple years ago.
Oh, yeah. I got cleaned up a little bit. I look more presentable now. So today I'm going to go over. This the stuff on stratification is taught all semester. Um, some of this stuff is advanced social theory, and I'm going to go into some things this morning with race and identity and ethnicity and identity and the history of this and the social construction of race, um, and the history of racial formation in the Americas and the West, and how that came into being in these these pseudoscientific theories on race and how it was used. I mean, it's important to understand too this concept was used to divide and prop up systems of social and economic and political advantage. You saw that with that film on the war on drugs. There were segments in there that pointed to that, and it was a very coercive type of thing that kind of evolved that was used by the elites. Uh, and this thing kind of comes back. Um, you know, it's like the floorboard of history, right? It goes under the floorboard: anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, racialized groups. You know how groups get racialized. Um, and Dr. Gates at Harvard, said this that it's the floor underneath the floorboard. This stuff kind of creeps up from time to time, doesn't it? Right? Because what happens with stratification, whether it's racial or class or political stratification, it's embedded in institutions, right? These are historical and political and economic and institutional practices, right, create societal outcomes, right? So to change societal outcomes with why certain social groups um, um, suffer certain disparities, so sociologists are going to look at, what in these institutions are creating this disparities for these outcomes for these groups, and as well as what goes on at the micro level, how these groups that put performance schools and all these type of things. So we'll end up there today with that. So how to really think about race and ethnicity sociologically is in relation to dominant group, subordinate group dynamic. Okay, and with stratification, right? Remember, there's mechanisms that maintain it and create it. One of them is exclusion, right? Exploitation, and also ideologies that support systems, right, of economic and political advantage for some groups. Okay, so we're looking at this. How did the dominant group come into dominance, right? So we got to look at histories. We got to look at political arrangements and economic and all this type of stuff. Um, when you're looking at ethnicity, you're looking at identity construction, right? And how we construct our identity. And many people define themselves along religious and ethnic lines, right? Sometimes identity can be imposed, by a power structure, or it can be asserted from a particular, social group. Uh, Now, when you look at race, right, and how this kind of pseudoscientific theory evolved, sociologists point to it as social construction. It's not real. Remember the social construction of reality, right? If people that define their situations as real, they're real and their consequences, right? Social construction of race looks at how this was socially constructed and gave meaning to throughout historical and political and economic arrangements, right? And its impact on individuals, okay? Now, right, when we're looking at, right, this stuff as it grew, right, these theories, right, we uncover certain historical realities with colonialism, right? And this stuff starts to pop into historical texts around, 1450 or so, 1500s. And, these elites with the colonial expansion, especially in the West, needed ideologies to justify going into, right, and, taking over, certain areas of the world, right? Uh, and so, ideology is the blueprint for social engineering, right? And, James Baldwin, the famous, cultural figure in America, said it took a vast amount of coercion, right, before this became, right, a white country, right, in the West. And so, sociologically, we'll look at how that grew, and with the growth of nation states, and social Darwinism, um, and really this junk science, right? These very thin arguments, because scientifically we know there are different races, right? And a lot of people don't know that, right? We're socialized to think there's difference and there's all these different racial, categories, but the Human Genome Project solidified, the arguments, this social theory has been putting forward for some time now, that 90, I think it's 99, half a percent accounts for your phenotype, right? And we know anthropologically how phenotype came into being with the migration of groups. So we're looking at these things now. You can apply this to a lot of different societies. And if you remember when I was getting into culture and we're talking about xenophobia and ethnocentrism and things like that. So if we're putting this into, right, and we're going to plug in the historical stuff of immigration and how that kind of evolved. The dominant group is the ethno-national group, right? And there's more, there's more, when you look at ethnic status, right? Your ethno-national groups, those are the dominant group. Those are seen as more honorable statuses in a given society. Then down from there, you have ethnocultural groups, right? And that can split into all types of different identities, can it, right? And then along with that, then you have ethno-linguistic, right, identities. You see how that works. And then also ethnic religious, right, identities that are at play here, right? And so when you go down the status hierarchy, right, at the bottom of that, the dishonorable status, right, or the inferior statuses in a given society, are groups that are ethnically or ethno-racial group that are racialized, right? And usually, those are the newly arrived immigrant groups, groups that have been historical in subordinate positions. If you look at what's happening in China right now with the ethnic Uyghur, the Muslim, right, minority there, and what China's doing, if you ever read any stories on that, they're rounding these people up and they're putting them in camps and re-indoctrinating them and things like that. It's pretty repressive, right? But this happens all the time. And what we know about how those ethnic statuses work, right, within power structures, is it's used to scapegoat certain social groups, right? This is the problem, not that economic and wealth inequality has gone through the roof and very little it's concentrated in the hands of a few, but it's actually these undeserving immigrants or these newly arrived people, or when you look at the history of slavery and things like that, right? The lower classes, right? Classism as well as racism, right? So these things get at play and they come in force. So you see this with certain groups after 9/11. Muslims and anyone from the Middle East or looked Middle Eastern were racialized automatically. And before that, this was a very honorable ethnocultural group, right? They were very prominent as far as in science and academia, professors, senator. very affluent, right? Very prosperous, very, embedded into communities, which all, immigrant groups do. They build businesses and families, places of worship, etc. Mexicans have been racialized throughout history. It ebbs and flows. Different Latino groups as well. And of course, the anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, the anti-Catholicism. So, these things, and you saw that with Dr., what was his name again? His chain of destruction theory, right? When he looked at racial drug laws and things like that, and looked at immigration. So when groups come in and new groups become more prosperous, right? He used the example of the Chinese. We'll get into this in a little bit. It picks workers, right? It's a threat to. That's why you see this this issue of immigration come back and forth all the time in political discourse, don't you? Right? It's always, the border or immigration, because it sets off those buzzwords, right? Especially with, white working classes, they come for your job. It's always this thing with labor and jobs, right? So, those are some concrete examples of its uses, right? And the tools and how it is, used to, divide the world. And it's a very, very useful tactic in the culture wars. Democrats and Republicans alike use this, right? So going back now in history, right? And just stay with me this morning. I'm going to go into some advanced stuff. If you're thoroughly confused by the end of class, you've learned something. So really how this emerges in the early Americas, remember mechanisms of exclusion exploitation, right? With the beginning of this nation, right? Who was it? They increased need of labor, right? As the early colonies are established, right? It was the indigenous population that dominated, right? So this is where that coercion goes in the very exploitative, which led into like genocidal acts against indigenous people, was the early expansion, right? And it was an increase for labor, because what we know historically is these elites weren't going to do any of the dirty work, were they? It wasn't the best and brightest that were coming from Europe and that they were bringing, right? And sometimes historians call it, in Nancy Eisenbarrow's book, White Trash, right? She looked at the historical names and things like that, how poor people, right, were exploited in the early colonies, and how that came into being even into today, right? Dongo people, right? It was the vagrants, right, that they clear the woods, and it was swamp. It was treacherous, to fight the Indian wars and all that type of stuff. And then, and this is really where it gets complicated now, right? With the increased need of labor. And so, they have, poor whites, indentured servants, right? And, doing all the work in the increased need of labor. And then you have throw in the transatlantic slave trade, right? Most of these people, that ended up in the Caribbean and South America, a percentage of them wound up in America. And what had happened is, so the colonial elites were developing ideologies to support this expansion, right? And that's the kind of like the golden rule of colonialism. Like, our way is, is the best way. We're going to civilize, everybody else, the savage beasts and all that, garbage. And what's happening is these right, the laborers, right, the slaves, right, the white slaves and black slaves, right, outnumbered the elites. And they were getting sick and tired of getting their clocks cleaned by the elites, in the early colonies. And they began rebelling, right? And they had a hell of a time stopping these slave rebellions, right? Well documented in history. And they were really concerned because it was a small percentage, that really controlled the economic and political power. And there was something that happened in Haiti, right, that they took note further down the line, right? The slave rebellion in Haiti, very close to America, right? Um, Napoleon sends, right, 30,000 Polish soldiers down there, right? The Slavic army, right? Slavic, that's where that word slave comes from, slavish, the Slavic people, right? Poles, Yugoslavians, and so on and so forth. So, here's this group that's been slaves and has been, marginalized throughout history. And they go to Haiti, and what they see more in common with, right, the slave rebellion. And they're sick and tired of getting their clock cleaned by Napoleon. And what do these 30,000 Polish soldiers do? They take up arms with the slaves. And if it wasn't for that Polish army, right, so they betray the French, they cross enemy lines. Is what's this beautiful story of talk about white allies, right, in social justice stuff. And they overthrow, right, and they become the first free black, nation in the West. Very concerned, so back on the American shore, and even to this day, you see, they have a museum there. They're holding in very high status, the Polish in Haiti. But a lot of people don't know that story. So back to America, what's happening now, what they begin doing is, again, using this tool to divide, right, these groups. So they go to the white, right, slaves, right, and these white, folks that were working with the slave rebellions, and say, here, look, we're going to give you a little land. We start offering them carrots, right? You're like us, you're white like us, right? We're going to give you what Du Bois called a psychological wage, right? Kind of an honorable status. You're what? You're not like those inferior Africans, and with their whatever, right? Matter of fact, we're going to put you on slave patrol. All right. You control those people. And of course, what do? They take the bait, don't they? They take the race bait, right? Despite the same economic similarities, right? This social group takes the race bait, right? Okay, get them a little power, give them a gun, right? Put them on slave patrol, give them a little status, make them feel good, right? Even though when we go back to the plantation and we sit on the porches, you're still white trash, and we're not even going to write you into the first laws of the land, right? We're going to use nice words like only free white people of good character, which doesn't count you, right? You're the lower classes. You're the dungle people, right? The trash people. So these whites are hoodwinked, right? Bamboozled, right? Run amok. And but what happens is this is where whiteness, right? And these categories really take a foothold in dominant ideologies in the Americas. And early racial formations of whiteness and white and black and all these things emerge, and again emphasize in Du Bois and within sociology, even up to today, how race has been used to hide class, despite the same economic similarities that we're all in, right? Especially middle and working class folks. We still cling to this identity, right? And it's still a tool to divide us, right? And it's used in very coercive ways. It worked back then, it works to today. And so, as the increased need for labor, right, the country is really expanding. Industrial revolution is starting to take a foothold. Huge waves of Irish begin coming. Of course, another despised group. They were the N-words of Europe. They spoke a bastard tongue of English. They were dirty. They drank a lot. They had all these foul character traits. They weren't of good character. But what are they doing? They're doing digging the canals, doing all the dirty work for the elites. And by 1815, that kicked in. And before that, you had the 1790 law of Immigration and Naturalization Act, which stated that only free white people of good character, right, which only gave status and citizenship to upper class whites.
Can you repeat that 1790 law? What was that called again?
It's the Immigration and Naturalization Act, 1790. Um, so throughout the 1800s, big waves of Irish and other immigrant groups are coming, and alongside, you have the abolitionist movement, really taken into fruition, and mass society and the underclasses are really dominant, right? Um, and we're heading up into the Civil War now. They saw what happened in Haiti. Uh, and again, what do? They hoodwink and they, use these, poor whites mainly, to fight the war, right? And um, after the Civil War, you got 500,000 people dead, right? And what, again, it wasn't the elites that were fighting this war. It was everyday people, the common folk, the underclasses. So what happens after the Civil War and post Reconstruction? What happens now? Now they redesign the social structure, right? And they redesign that largely. They do it in the North too, but especially in the South, right? In a very coercive way, with even some of these stuff today with voter suppression laws and stuff like that. This stuff was going on back then. Um, so what you have is, after Reconstruction, for example, Black Americans, right? In 1885, very few were educated and literate, right? Very few, small business, right? Very few, schools. A lot of people, the majority were illiterate, right? By 1920, you got a huge, right, burgeoning, Black capitalist class, right? You have the Harlem Renaissance. You have jazz explodes, all these artistic forms, big communities, right? They go to almost full literacy now, and they did it by community building, right, with schools and doing this especially in the South. They were left kind of out there to dry after the Civil War. Well, they do build it through families, institutions, places of worship. Dr. Gates has a series now on, he does a lot of the PBS stuff on the Black church in America and how that came to be. Even to this day, you see that very strong community. So it was very early, groups, working for this. And at the same time, you had rapid industrialization in the North. A lot of these groups, these Blacks, were getting out of the South, being recruited for jobs, right? And to get out of, the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacist structure down there. And then you had a massive wave of Eastern Europeans again come in 1880. Your Poles, right? A lot of the Slavics, the Italians, the Germans, the Jews, Catholics, a lot of Irish. All these groups were despised, right? Treated as inferior, subjugated, and treated the same way Blacks were in the North. Couldn't live where they wanted to. They were darker complected. They didn't speak a proper English. They had bad habits, bad, character traits. If they did speak English, it was kind of a pidgin English. It wasn't proper. And the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, kind of saw this as a threat, and also did the political leadership did, right? And so you see these kind of very, racial appeals, right, to that dominant white group. This was the end of America. These ethnics are coming, right? And this is, they're bringing their filth, and we need to do something. They're the problem, right? So they throw all these Eastern Europeans on the bus, like they did with these Blacks that are coming from the North. And so really, this is like early, really ghettoization of northern cities with these immigrant groups with roadhouses and things like that. And so these groups, again, form kind of an alliance, right? And so you have, these Eastern Europeans that were subjugated and, thrown on the bus, treated as inferior. And, by 1924, I think there was like 40 million between 1880 and 1924. And I mean, you can see in the historical accounts, and some of you probably learned about this in history class if you've taken or studied history. They use this, very, very much uh, as a political prop, to divide and rule and to scapegoat these groups. And xenophobia was at an all-time high, right? Earlier, they had done this Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. After the Chinese. Again, these are groups that are a threat to dominant groups, especially the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And in 1970, early 1900s, you had huge anti-Asian racism in the West, with the Japanese, especially the Chinese. And this is where that first drug law came into being, with the opium laws and the Harrison Act. That film got into that. And then the second, the other law that came is with Mexicans, right? With marijuana laws. Again, another immigrant group that was a threat, to mainstream society and white workers, right, and wages and stuff like that. Again, pitting workers, especially the white working class, against these groups, which is, some would argue, still happens today with, pitting white working class against, immigrants and people of color. So, they put the kibosh on immigration in 1924. That was it, right? No more. This was, if we don't stop it now, and you can see the historical records on this, it'd be the end. And so that pretty much, put extreme limits on immigration. Now what happens now, really capitalism goes through its first big test, doesn't it? Right, 1929. You had the Bolshevik Revolution, in the Soviet Union became, with Lenin, and they were really concerned, the Debs with communism and socialism, and especially with the unionization effort, right, along, right, color lines, right, laborers working together, organizing, and they did this in the labor unions to split white workers and black workers and Latino and Asian and whatever, right? But the bottom falls out of capitalism in 1929, and people really start to question, shit, why should I believe this stuff, right? And it was actually a lot of the early social reformers, they were kind of critical of, and kind of suspect. Sociology gets its beginnings at this time, and of course, Du Bois is writing like crazy, right, at this time. He studies under Max Weber. He studied in Germany. Comes back here, finishes PhD at Harvard. And so the Depression, what do these elites need now? They need a scapegoat, don't they? And one convenient one, especially out west, right, were the Asians and the Mexicans especially, right? And they had the wetback roundups out west, where they took Mexicans on trains, rounded them up and drove them deep into Mexico, so they couldn't, took their papers away and couldn't. Of course, we know that was stolen land to begin with, right, in the West. You had the Zoot Suit riots, and it was a lot of xenophobia in this time in the 30s. And again, it was another bait and switch, right? It wasn't the economic system or, to see these groups. So more groups, are assimilating, right, within the American mainstream, building families, building places of worship, building businesses, right, working hard. And that's something on the left and right politically, that's pretty much an agreement, that immigration is a good thing, right? It's good economically. It builds communities. When you look in society, but it's also an issue that the elites will use, right, to kind of create this, frenzy about, the border and all this type of stuff. and just spending ridiculous amounts on the border and all this crazy stuff. Uh, so now what happens, right, in 1942, right, by 1942, they had labor shortages with World War II. They round up the Japanese in internment camps. People forget too, they did this with the Germans in World War One. The Germans and Italians were extremely vilified groups. In World War One, they were German internment camps. They were turning away young German Jewish kids, in America. There was a case where I think 30,000 of them they sent back to Germany during World War II, and these kids, ended up going to die because of the anti-Semitism in America and the anti-Catholicism. And they needed labor, right? So they turned to Mexico now. They start the Brasil program. Hey, sorry about that. In the 30s, they didn't mean to throw you under the bus, but can you come? So they expand this guest worker program, and large groups of Mexicans now are circling, and other Latino groups in and out of establishing communities. And they never really gave them a clear path to citizenship. They kind of dogged them out. And they stopped that program, I think, in 1964, the Brasil program. And so it essentially, Douglas Macy, a sociologist at Princeton, is the Mexican Migration Project. If you Google that, you can see they basically trapped these groups, and they give them a path to citizenship. And it was more complicated to get there, but it's kind of like, we need you now, right? But then we're not gonna. The same thing happens with immigrant groups in Europe. When you're Middle Eastern, they don't, France especially, they don't necessarily, they push them out to the least desirable areas, right, to live, and they don't really give them a clear path to citizenship. So by 1960s, you have the social movements of the 60s, right? You have a whole cadre of movements. You have the anti-war movement with Vietnam. People are really suspect of government and political leadership, right? They're seeing their 18-year-old kids go to Vietnam and dying, and they're seeing this stuff on TV. They're seeing the hoses and the dogs on black folks and the other people that were down in the South protesting. The cities erupt. And you have white and black, broad coalitions, right? Latino, Asian, Puerto Rican, all these groups, Cubans, right? Starting, right? The social justice type of movements. And they begin to appease, a lot of this stuff, right? And so by 1964, they look at that 1924 Immigration Act and say, what, that was a racist act, we're enlightened now, so we're going to reform immigration. Then you had the Voting Rights Act, and then they desegregated housing soon after that. Embedding these institutional practices, right, especially geared toward keeping groups, that were traditionally in subordinate groups, to give them more opportunity, right? Now, what happens is, and we'll get into this with Mills's theory and his book, The Power Elite, and what happens is you have a very concerted effort to push back, right, on all these social movements, right? You really have a white backlash, especially among middle and upper classes. Northern whites don't really buy into the civil rights gains, right? They say it's all nice and everything, but once they start, it's kind of like NIMBY, not in my backyard, right? And that's something historians are in agreement. Northern whites move, they take their money, their cap, they move to the exurbs, your gated communities and things like that. And they redesign really the social structures with neighborhoods and schooling and zoning and stuff like that, redlining, more some of these more advanced things. The film that you guys watched, The House I Live In, had a segment on redlining and really how the urban design of ghettos and how that came into being. And by 1970, William Julius Wilson's work at the University of Chicago, he wrote a book called The Declining Significance of Race, right? And he notes that joblessness, right, and economic, right, opportunity just, especially in Chicago, vanishes. These factories, because of the interstate highway, the suburbs are built. These were off limits up until housing was desegregated. And joblessness hits the cities in the 70s and 80s big time, right? And then also, the war on drugs and the crime fighting rhetoric taking the foothold. Well, now guess what happens, right? All these groups become really, American success stories, right? That were kept out, subjugated, with different institutional designs, inequality as far as zoning and neighborhood codes, and all these advanced ways to enforce discrimination and segregation, things like that in the North. and talking about in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? These things still go down even to today. You see that. And America starts to become this really racial, ethnic type of multicultural society, doesn't it? You see the rise of a lot of pop stars and popular culture, in music, hip hop explodes. And by 1990s, you have this backlash still amongst, especially, middle class in certain segments that were not really down with a lot of the civil rights gains, the lot of the gains of LGBT community, a lot of the left activism, a lot of the environmental stuff and that type of stuff. And Reagan used this, kind of talked and very carefully. If you look at Ian Haney Lopez's talk, he has a book called Dog Whistle Politics. You understand that dog whistle politics works. Kind of buzzwords. You saw this in that film, The House I Live In. When you say, crime or immigration, it sets up these buzzwords, especially with whites. And so, Clinton kind of was an interesting era in the 90s. He doubles down on the drug war, 94 crime bill. He, uses words like, these super predators, in reference to, Black youth and, all the Democrats and Republicans, white, Black, everyone, the Congressional Black Congress are down and doubling down on the crime bill. And then in 96, he guts welfare, really ends welfare as we know it, right? With the welfare to work bill. He courts these old Reagan Democrats, or the Blue Dog Democrats, into the Democratic Party. And by 2001, after 9/11 happens, right, this xenophobia, especially against, Middle Eastern identities, happens. You get the war on terror, endless wars. And who's going to fight these wars? Largely the members of the underclass, young kids, right? Poor kids that are fighting these wars. And you saw like a ticking time bomb of the economy, right, was happening. And that time bomb was in housing. And in September of 2008, right, the economy collapsed. And it was scary that, credit froze up, the market, people lost a lot, man. And your parents, most of you in here probably remember that. It was pretty scary. Well, check this. There's a new name in town, and he goes by the name of Barack Obama, not very American. Actually, his name was Barack Hussein Obama. When I went to go vote, right, and I see that, I said, there's no way this guy is gonna, what do, right? He takes down an elite member of the Democratic Party, wins the Democratic nomination, and he's going against John McCain, right? Very, very heavy guy, man, upright in character, American POW in Vietnam. I mean, this guy was decorated. McCain he doesn't go there. He could dangle the race bait and, you know, throw Obama under the bus. You know, all these crazy things they're saying about he's Muslim and, you know, he's not from here, the birther stuff. You know, they other him, right? And that's what happens with race and ethnicity, right? With those tools, othering groups, right? It's a more advanced term. McCain says, you know what, I'm not going to go there, right? He runs. He's a straight up man. He's you know, he's a freshman senator, good guy. Runs a very clean. He doesn't use the very coded racial appeals that Clinton and um, um, Ronald Reagan used, and in some degree George Bush. I don't think he really, you know, went there a lot on that. That was more on the war on terror and all this stuff. But that was also a code word too. And he wins. And he wins, you know, by, you know, we're gonna change the status quo. People were really suspect of government political actors, you know, they'd lost everything. And there was all this hope, right? And people were like, wow, you know, we just lost everything. Keep in mind, the economy tanked, and we'll come back to this moment in 2008. He wins and you know, takes over in November, or not, in January, he gets inaugurated, first black president, right? Equally white as he is black, right? Uh, um, had to really prove himself an amazing story within the black community in Chicago. They thought of him as an elite, you know, I mean, even like articles in the Chicago Reader, there's a famous one that said he was a white person in black mask. And, you know, the Chicago political machine is very nasty. If anyone lives around Chicago or, you know, knows, have, you know, grandparents or mom and dad has lived there. It's an old school political machine, man. And, you know, he was this Harvard educated person, you know, really, his white grandparents raised him a lot. You know, his mother was an anthropologist. He spent time in Malaysia with her, doing field work there. Didn't really fit into a white world or black world, in this idea of identity. If you look in his book, Dreams from My Father. But he, almost immediately, right, you know, he is othered, right? By 2010, you know, you have the Tea Party movement, you have the birther movement, and what you happen, even though this white working class that eventually flipped for him and voted for him twice, not once, right, in those swing counties in Wisconsin and Michigan, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, that put him over the top over John McCain. Twice these people voted for him. And exit polls on 2016 found, right, what did those counties go for in 2016? They went for Donald Trump. Donald Trump really kind of emerges and rebrands himself, right? And he does this by getting, you know, going after that white anxiety of the white working class, you know, that seeing their jobs go away, right? They had legitimate, right, concerns with middle America. The towns are done, all lives have gotten continually worse and worse and worse, right? And, you know, there's no job, the factories are gone, you know, they've just for decade after decade saw them, and no, and they voted for Obama. And Donald Trump really doubles down kind of on the culture wars, doesn't he? He really doesn't start talking about race in the abstract, but it's more like, you know, kind of in your face bullhorn type of words, you know, very carefully orchestrated. And no one took him serious. They're like, who's this guy? You know, he's like so 1980s. We thought he was done, right? He was like on his third or fourth, fifth bankruptcy, right? You know, he was this 80s cultural figure, but he's back, right? And, you know, he slowly starts taking down people in the Republican Party, elite members of the Republican Party, you know, Jeb Bush, you know, Marco Rubio, upstanding, really heavy guys. No one gave him a chance, you know. At the same time, you had someone that was addressing the same concerns amongst the middle and working class voters, Bernie Sanders, right? We'll come to this in a couple of weeks. And he really, it's, I don't know if it's a matter of debate, kind of got railroaded in the end, didn't he? Because people are like, oh, we don't really want Hillary. It's just another, you know, white woman in pumps, and we need more Clintons. It's going to be the same leftovers from that. We need new blood. You know, Obama really offered the Democratic, rebranded the Democratic Party and put them back into the swing of things. You know, people loved him. You know, people really liked him. But there was, and so this, you know, in 2016, I mean, you know, people, he won, right? And you know, it was kind of the fireworks began, didn't it? So you have this fissure again, you know, within American society along these same lines, right? That's reared its head, right? If you remember when we went back to the beginning, right? And I emphasized a couple things. One, the uses of, you know, it being a tool of the political and economic elites, right? To divide and rule. It's oldest trick in the book. Du Bois talked about that. He talked about the psychological wages, right? Despite the same economic circumstances, right? That people are in, especially the middle and working class in middle America, the people that vote for Donald Trump, the people that voted, you know, for Barack Obama, for people, you know, who along class lines, you know, you dangle that race bait out there and people will take it. You know, Du Bois talked about that. That's going to be a problem. That was a problem in during slavery days. What they did that with you know, the poor whites, and so and it happens both ways too, right? It's very useful. Meanwhile, gains have gone really to the top. So when you have with the social movements of today, with a lot of the identity politics, and the social justice, you know, type of warriors and that type of racial justice, you know, we see these things come up again, you know, with police killings, you know, seeing the remnants, right, of all these systematic, right, inequalities that have affected groups that traditionally have been marginalized, exposed because of the pandemic, right? It's all out there. Are we going to fix it, or are we just going to kind of go down this little tit for tat culture war, you know, type of thing, or are we going to, you know, get broad coalitions? And so, you know, you don't get a lot of in your face like critique of, you know, class inequality. A lot of and you know, I mean, Adolph Reed Jr., a scholar, Black scholar, Du Boisian scholar at Penn and Cornell West, would say that, you know, this is a tool of the ruling class to make people not think about, you know, the large scale concentration of wealth and income power. That the social justice stuff was something that's used by the Democratic and Republican elites to kind of divert, you know, attention to real problems. That's a matter of debate. I mean, that's a whole nother class, another thing there. Just to put it in context today, what's happened, especially since last summer. So, I mean, questions on this stuff? Do you follow me?
Yeah, I'm with you.